With the collapse of the first party system, the dissolution of the Federalist Party, and the fracturing of the Democratic Republican Party, we move into what is known as the second party system, which begins with the creation of the second parties, and that is the Whig Party, or We Hope in God Party. And we'll see the election of 1836 and the Panic of 1837, and then one of the great presidential campaign slogans of all time, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Andrew Jackson won re-election to the presidency very easily in 1832. But now the anti-Jackson forces, led by Clay and Calhoun, formed a new party called the Whigs. They were anti-Jackson, anti-monarchical. They were anti-Masonic, which meant that Stevens and Sumner were members of this. They were adherents to the American economic system, that is Henry Clay, or the National Republicans. Nullifiers from the South, led by Calhoun. And the Whig Party had a very, very broad base. And it was too broad and too diverse at first. Nonetheless, the Whigs were the new party, and it had a certain attraction being new. And in 1834, the midterm elections, the Whigs won 40% of the Congress. And they were able to do things like block Martin Van Buren's appointment as ambassador to England. Jackson then turned around and made him vice president, though. In 1836, the Whigs decided, rather than choose one candidate that would be very badly defeated, they would let each region of the country choose 4 candidates. And so Daniel Webster was the choice of the Northeast, Hugh Lawson White from the South, W.P. Magnum for the Nullifiers, and William Henry Harrison of the Old Northwest out of Ohio. The Democrats, much better organized, had a very clear leader, Martin Van Buren, a New York machine politician, and the first truly American president. That is, he's the first president to be born after the signing of the Declaration. He had headed the kitchen cabinet for Andrew Jackson. Now, Van Buren wins, but the Whigs increased their influence in Congress. And Martin Van Buren inherited many of Andrew Jackson's problems. You see there a picture of a young Martin Van Buren, the little wizard, as he was often called. And here you see a caricature of Martin Van Buren, often nicknamed Martin Van Ruin. And in case you think that this was overly exaggerated, that is an actual photograph of Martin Van Buren later in his life. Andrew Jackson had actually left Martin Van Buren with a very, very bad situation that was caused by his economic policies. Interestingly enough, ideology and personal hatred and personal caprices are not a very good foundation for passing laws, in case you did not know. Jackson refused to renew the charter of the National Bank and then began to withdraw government funds from the bank, which made the bank need to call in its loans from other people. And then Jackson issued the specie circular, which meant that land acquisitions would have to be done in specie only, not cash money as in paper money, but in coin. And there's only a limited amount of coin. And this made people run on the bank looking to cash in their paper money for specie, hard currency. And since there was a limited supply, 343 of 850 banks throughout the nation collapsed, causing widespread unemployment and depression as the banks were calling in loans, causing businesses to bankrupt. This led to layoffs and a depression. And Van Buren tries to fix this with the national treasury, but this actually takes even more money out of the economy. And the depression does not end until 1843. This leaves Van Buren very vulnerable to political adversaries, and it also leads once again to a movement west. You will recall the very young Colonel William Henry Harrison. Well, this was William Henry Harrison in 1840, a good 28 years after the War of 1812. He was 68 years old by this point, but still considered in decent enough health that he could be the standard bearer for the Whig Party. And so he will get the Whig nomination in 1840, excuse me. Since he was called Old Tippecanoe, the campaign slogan was Tippecanoe and Tyler too, because he chose John Tyler of Virginia as his vice presidential running mate. The election of 1840 featured a very serious gaffe by Martin Van Buren, who looked down his nose at the supporters of William Henry Harrison, calling them basically a bunch of hayseeds who lived in log cabins and drank hard cider. And so, as with any sort of pejorative leveled against a campaign, like deplorables and so forth, what happened was people embraced it instead. And so, this became the log cabin and hard cider campaign. It was a very bitter campaign with a very close popular vote, but William Henry Harrison won the Electoral College in a landslide. And William Henry Harrison has many issues as his inauguration approaches. The Depression has continued. There is westward expansion, and that's causing issues. There's a growing abolition movement, and now there's a growing sectional crisis between North and South in the country. This shows the electoral breakdown of the um, election of 1840 with the states that Harrison takes and the states that Van Buren takes. Unfortunately, William Henry Harrison never had the opportunity to lead. To show everybody what a tough guy he was, he took his oath of office on a very cold, wet day without wearing a coat or a top hat. He caught a cold. The cold turned into pneumonia. He died 31 days after he took office as President of the United States, leaving John Tyler as the President. William Henry Harrison was elected in the year 1840, and it started a string of presidents elected in a year ending in zero, all of whom would die in office either through illness or assassination. Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield, William McKinley, Warren G. Harding, Franklin Roosevelt, and John F. Kennedy